Hello everyone. In this video we're going to see about constructors used in Java. Firstly we'll see what is a constructor. A constructor is simply a block of codes just like the methods that we use in a class, but the one thing that differentiates a constructor from a method is that a constructor will have the name as same as that of the class for which it is created, and it is created when an object for the same class is being created, so that constructor can initialize that object. An object is created using the keyword new. So secondly, why do we call it a constructor? The literal meaning of constructor is something that builds an object or anything. So the same way in Java or any other programming language, a constructor is something that builds value for an object that is being created for the class. So it is not necessary that we have to explicitly create a constructor for a class that is being created in Java. Because when a constructor is not given by the user, the Java compiler itself creates a default constructor for that class. There are three basic rules that are being used to create a constructor in Java. So firstly, as we saw before, a constructor's name should be as same as that of the class for which it is created. That is what differentiates a constructor from other methods. Secondly, what differentiates a constructor from other methods is the use of return types. While we create methods, we give our return types for them like void and int. But in the case of constructors, we don't give any return types. And thirdly, Java constructor cannot be abstract. While we create a constructor to be abstract, then it cannot have a body for itself. And constructors are used for initializing objects, so it definitely cannot be static. And thirdly, while we use a class which is being inherited, a constructor cannot be inherited, and we all know that. So that being so, there is no use of using this final keyword. So that way the Java compiler doesn't allow us to use the final keyword before a constructor. And talking about being synchronized, the JVM, that is the Java Virtual Machine, allows a thread to call one constructor at a time. So that being so, a Java constructor cannot be abstract, static, final, and synchronized. Now let's come to the types of constructors used in Java. There are two types. The first one is default constructors and the second one is parameterized constructors. Now let's see about these types in detail. So let's see about default constructors. Default constructor is something that doesn't have parameters list inside the parenthesis. So we have a sample given here. We have created a class called bike. While we have not created a explicit constructor, the compiler itself creates a default constructor in the name of the class, and this we've seen in the previous slide. In the first case, a default constructor was created by the compiler itself because the user did not give a constructor explicitly for that class. And in this case, for the class called bike1, constructor is being explicitly created, and this is a default constructor because it doesn't have any parameters list inside the parenthesis. And below that constructor, we are trying to print a sentence. Bike is created, and the main function, we are calling that constructor with an object called b, and the output bike is created is being successfully executed. Let's move on to parameterized constructor. Parameterized constructor has a specific number of parameters. So why do we use parameterized constructor is to provide different values to distinct objects. It is not necessary that you have to give different values to each object, but in case you want to do that, we can use parameterized constructor. Now let's see an example for parameterized constructor. Here we've created a class student4, and we're creating a constructor for the same. And we can see that parameters like I and N have been passed to it. Next, we're creating a method called display, and we're trying to execute the values of ID and name. So that way we move on to the main function, and two objects called S1 and S2 are being created, and what we're trying to do is pass values to these objects. So thirdly, we are calling the method display using the objects S1 and S2, and that way the output is being executed as we see here. Now moving on to constructor overloading. Just like we perform method overloading in Java, we can also perform constructor overloading. So definitely while we do constructor overloading, every constructor for the same class is going to have the same name. But what it is going to be differentiated by is the list of parameters that we use. Because all the constructors are going to have the same name, so what the compiler does is it looks towards the parameters that are used for that constructor. So based on the type and number of parameters being used for that constructor, the compiler is going to differentiate it. So that way we know that only parameterized constructors can be overloaded and the default constructors cannot be overloaded.